afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to see so many of you here for this incredible, what I know will be an incredible lecture. I'm Wisdom Powell. I'm the director of the Health Disparities Institute, but also an affiliate here at InCHIP. And excited to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Courtney Cogburn. And I want to say a couple of things. I'm going to read her bio because when people are fabulous, you should read their bios. But I also want to just say that Courtney and I actually trained together at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And she was, I think, a year or so behind me, but always ahead of me. Right?
No.
I mean, just amazing, bright superstar from the very beginning.
Oh, thank you.
And we also share common history in the Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholars Program, where I was at University of California and she was at Harvard. So she brings to this conversation a wealth of both scientific expertise and practical knowledge and passion about work around racism. She is currently the associate professor at the Columbia University School of Social Work and faculty of the Columbia Population Research Center and Data Science Institute, where she co-chairs with Computational Social Science Working Group. She employs a transdisciplinary research strategy to improve the characterization and measurement of racism and in examining the role of racism in the production of racial inequities and inequalities in health. Dr. Cogburn's work also explores the potential of media and technology in creating and eradicating racism and racial inequities in health. She is the lead creator of 1000 Cut Journey, an immersive virtual reality experience of racism that premiered at the 2018 Tribeca Film Festival. Not many of us have that on our CDs. She's also the co-founder of the Justice, Equity Plus Technology Laboratory. She completed her postdoctoral training, as I mentioned, at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholar, and at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan, where she received her Ph.D. in Education and Psychology and Masters of Social Work from the University of Michigan, and a BA in Psychology from the University of Virginia. But I should say that Courtney is also gaining global recognition as a leading scholar in social justice and equity work, and particularly around the use of immersive technologies. I have heard people describe her this way, but I would also say this, that Dr. Cogburn solves problems of her discipline, but she also solves problems of the world, which I think is so needed in today's current climate. She particularly focuses on factors like police violence and race and health, and she's been establishing community partnerships with other organizations around the world who are interested in using virtual technology or virtual reality technology tools as a part of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Some of these organizations include ones we know, Planned Parenthood, Nike, Target, Viacom, to name a few. Her most recent paper, which I encourage you to read in Milbank Quarterly, is on cultural racism, and it integrates perspectives on cultural racism, on psychology, sociology, law, and public health, also on communication and media studies. And with that, I am proud and excited to introduce and welcome to the podium Dr. Cogburn.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me and joining me for yet another fun conversation about racism. It's going to be really cool and exciting. You forgive me, I'm getting over a cold, so I'll be coughing throughout, but I'll be fine. When I touched base with well, first of all, I want to say to the people who I've had the opportunity to meet with today and had dinner with last night, it's already been such a lovely visit. People are so intellectually engaged, so interdisciplinary in their thinking, and it's just been a really lovely visit. So thank you for those of you who took time to meet with me. When I had a chance to meet with the organizers about what they want me to focus on, I wear a lot of different hats and do a lot of different things, and there's only 45 minutes. And so given some of your recent events on campus, what I've decided to focus on are some of these questions around what racism is, because I find that even in liberal-leaning spaces, there's a misunderstanding, misframing of what racism is, and so I think that might be a useful conversation, and it directly leads into the work that I'm doing in virtual reality. That's actually the function that the virtual reality work is serving to address. But I will give an overview of some of the conceptual empirical work that I'm doing. I'm happy to speak with people about that work or direct them to papers or share some of the papers in progress if you're interested. So why does race matter for health? This is pretty central to the work that I do. And I think it's interesting to people sometimes when I say that race does not cause or influence anything. Race in and of itself is not a particularly meaningful or useful variable. And I would argue that if we only use race as a variable in our models to describe racial difference, we actually sort of are left with a bio-racist frame, right? If we don't interrogate the source of categorical racial differences, we're left with some assumption that there's something inherently meaningful about black and there's something inherently meaningful about white, as opposed to unpacking what that might mean. So checking a box black doesn't equal disease. If that's the case, as one of my mentors, James Jackson, likes to say, you can just check a different box and all those problems will go away. We know it's not that simple, right? It's what comes along with the box that we need to start unpacking and figuring out how to measure. And I would argue that it's insufficient to say that, well, that's too complicated. We don't know how to measure that. We know it matters, but we couldn't possibly measure that. So I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing in terms of measuring race as a variable. And I would argue that not only is it problematic, it's racist. So race matters for health in particular because racism matters. And we all need to spend more time thinking about and unpacking how that has relevance for our work in health. So what is racism? There's certain images that tend to come to mind when people think about racism. I don't show this to be provocative, it actually shouldn't be necessarily, but this is the sort of thing that people think of when they think about what racism is. And there's a problem with white liberalism in particular when we have this question of racism. There's this sense that because I wouldn't go to a meeting and put on a hood, then I'm not racist, right? So we're using this very narrow criteria for what racist is, and as long as I'm not that, it's all good, right? But I'm not racist. There becomes this sort of investment in your designation as racist or not. And as long as you get a sticker that says I'm not racist, that is sort of the extent of the engagement, right? So as long as you don't think I'm racist, then we're all good. And is that sufficient? Is that a sufficient way to engage issues of racism? I would argue it's a degree of narcissism, not big case N, uppercase N, I'm not diagnosing anyone, lowercase n, narcissism, focusing on yourself and how you see me as opposed to thinking about the problem out there. And this investment in being seen as a good person. As long as you think that I'm a good person, as long as you think that I'm not racist, that's the level of my engagement and involvement. Whether you're designated as racist or not is beside the point. What I'm more interested in is whether you're actively anti-racist, whether you're actively engaging the problem of racism in society, not excusing yourself because you think that you're not racist or someone once told you that you're not racist or because you're a good person. I'm more interested in more people actively working toward anti-racist engagement, policy, etc. And we have this tendency to think about bias as well, right? Specifically bias at an individual level, thinking about subconscious bias. Am I biased or not? Yes, you are, right? That's the quick answer. So moving on, what do we do with that information? And again, we can't only focus at the individual level, we have to move beyond that. We need to think about systems of bias. We need to think about cultural bias. We need to think about racism and its various manifestations that exist beyond the individual. So one of my favorite psychologists, Via Salter, says, rather than attempt to control expression of culturally constituted individual bias, a more effectual use of your personal agency may be to reconstruct worlds that promote anti-racist tendencies. So again, rather than being consumed with your individual designation as racist or biased or not, starting to expand outward and focus on society. So let's expand and complicate our view of what racism is. So I would argue that an anti-racist orientation is more behavior and policy focused. What am I doing? It's an active engagement rather than a personal inward engagement. Can you correct unconscious bias without correcting the toxic culture that produced that bias in the first place? If we haven't dealt with the messaging that we've received from birth, the imagery to which we've been exposed that helped produce that bias in the first place, what could you possibly do to undo that that would be lasting if we haven't actually engaged the broader context? Racism is not remedied by you being aware of your bias. Racism is not remedied by you feeling just really awful about all of this. That's really terrible what's happening over there. Racism is structural and cultural and baked in, and really thinking about unconscious bias on steroids. People of color are not the target for addressing racism. Let's pause on that for a second. So when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we tend to think about how do we take care of the people of color? How do we take care of the women? Rather than turning and thinking, what makes this a toxic place for them to live and thrive and be successful? And what do we need to do about the people and policies and cultures over here that make it a difficult place for them to live? That's a different intervention. It's a different focus. But we tend to focus on the people of color as if they are the source of the problem for the challenges that they face in the context in which we're trying to live and survive. Diversity won't fix racism. One of my colleagues, Ruha Benjamin, says plantations were very diverse places. Right? It's not just about color in the room. It's much more complicated than that. Issues of power and structure and policies, et cetera, come to bear on our experiences and something that needs to be considered explicitly. I would also argue that if it's not anti-racist, it's probably racist. Like I just said, it's baked in. So if we haven't actively considered how to undo the potential for disadvantaging a group of people around race, then we're probably defaulting into a norm that's disadvantaging them. So what is racism? I'll give you some examples. This is a white man in blackface dressed as Trayvon Martin for Halloween, seemingly thinking that this is funny and a joke, right, making light of the death of this child. There are images that I collected from this year. This was in 2014. This is one of many images that I collected. There's people who thought it would be a good idea to dress up as Trayvon Martin for Halloween. There's a commentary that this reflects, an ethos that this is sort of reflective of, which is whose lives do we value? Whose lives do we not value? How do we explicitly name that, and what are the more subtle ways in which we represent and talk about and name those things? It shows up in our language and media as well, the ways in which media and communication studies indicate that we treat white and black individuals in the media differently. When the media treats white suspects and killers better than black victims. A white boy who shot up a church is being treated to lunch and gently being guided out of the room, while a black victim may be treated as someone who's actually committed the crime, or we may actually show their mugshot. Now, it's one thing for me to show you a couple of headlines. It's another thing to direct you to an entire body of research that documents this pattern in our media. The ways in which we represent history. This is a shot from a textbook that says when the European settlers arrived, they needed land to live on. The First Nations people agreed to move to different areas to make room for the new settlements. This is what we call whitewashing, right? Who has control of a narrative? Who has control over how we represent and talk about history? I've been appalled at the lack of education that many of my white colleagues in particular have about the racial history of our country and where we actually come from and where we actually are. And this is not acceptable, right? And so thinking more about how do we collectively engage these issues in a deeper and more meaningful way. Comes up with the notion of dog whistles, right? How we use coded language when we talk about racial issues. I like to use this quote from Paul Ryan, or this headline with Paul Ryan saying, blaming poverty on lazy inner city men. He doesn't say black, he doesn't use the word race, he uses racially charged language of lazy inner city men. In the same interview, Paul Ryan cites a scholar who has suggested that blacks are genetically inferior. Paul Ryan didn't say blacks are genetically inferior. He relied on the words of someone else in the context of blaming poverty on lazy inner city men. This is a congressman, right? So these attitudes are not just about someone's individual level of bias. It's who has control of policy and power to make decisions about how we address and solve important social issues and what is driving their decision making. This is an interview with an aide who worked under Nixon in the 1970s, Nixon's original war on drugs. And when he was being interviewed, he said, "You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities," Ehrlichman said. "We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." This person, who was a close aide to the President of the United States, is talking about the use of federal policy to directly target a group of people. Let's put the legacy of slavery to the side, which we can't actually do. You take this one policy choice and play this out. Do the math on the impact that that's had on the Black community. But when we talk about mass incarceration, we're not referencing the roots of drug policy. We're talking about super predators and cracking down on crime, even though crime is at its lowest level in 20 years. Because we have an individual frame of who's responsible for this pattern that we're observing in society. Let's blame that group and fix that group because they're responsible. We do it with health as well. We have all this sort of assessment of social determinants of health, and yet we still go and say, you fix your behavior. You eat better, you exercise, you make better choices and decisions, and collectively you'll all be healthy. And don't really grapple with the reality of the effects of social determinants of health, and specifically racism as a social determinant of health. He's also, by the way, referencing the use of media to create a narrative around a group of people, which I've also just talked about in the previous slides, right? It's also coming up in your own context. And excuse me, this information has been shared with me right before I arrived, and I actually wasn't aware of it before I got here. But in addition to 2 UConn students yelling out racial slurs, walking through campus, the fact that students have to demand action, that they had to be the ones to drive a response to this, is also an exposure to racism. Having to do that, if we're thinking about implications of racial stressors for health, having to do that is a racial stressor. The reaction of the institution clearly having a racist incident using diversity as a response to racism. Diversity is not the problem. Do you think introducing more people of color in a place that's already leaning toward racist tendencies is going to become more comfortable with the more people of color that you introduce into this space? Diversity is not your issue, and the people of color are not your target. Your Mansfield town manager, this dude. I hate Black people. Okay. And then the response. So there's the event itself. Someone saying, "I hate Black people," right? That's of course racism. That's the KKK. It's very obvious. But then the town council is going to conduct an independent review, and when I read the article, it says to find out what happened and why. We know what happened, and we know why it happened. This is not the response to this blatant racial event. What are you saying? That you don't believe this is what it is? Why is an independent review the response to this? I think all of this is racism. Our ways we respond, the ways we frame and categorize, the narratives we create around issues of race, all falls under this umbrella. It's not just KKK hoods. It suggests that we have particular attitudes about race, that we have particular values around race and racialized bodies that enter into our decision-making processes. So racism is policies, processes, norms, cultures that are historically grounded and that systematically advantage white racial groups and disenfranchise non-white racial groups. So, excuse me, my work, as Wisdom introduced, is kind of invested in, again, the conceptualization and measurement of these issues. So I have a conceptual body of work, 2 papers, body of work that's starting to think about and unpack some of this. And then I have empirical complement. So how do I go about trying to measure some of the effects of these things? And so this is what I'm not going to go into today, but I do work where I expose people to different types of media and then monitor their physiological stress responses while they consume that media to try and get a sense of, is this kind of exposure that's not happening to you, it's vicarious, it's in the air, does that have implications for health? Doing work around tracking police violence in the media, et cetera, and trying to think about creative ways to link that to population health, which is tricky. We were just talking about this. But the project I'll focus on today is the immersive virtual reality work, which is trying to think about, is there something meaningful about immersing yourself in an experience that's different than your own that might help change attitudes, cognitive processes, and behavior? So can immersive virtual reality help influence the ways in which we engage racism? So this builds, of course, like on a broad and rich perspective, taking empirical literature, but we're specifically thinking about perspective taking in virtual reality. And what we're finding is that virtual reality can be very powerful in inducing experiences that are prohibitive, too expensive, or just impossible to do in real life. And so you can create virtual experiences that can fill in some of those gaps. And what some of the, it's still a nascent empirical literature, but what some of the findings are suggesting is that embodying different perspectives, whether it's a man becoming a woman or experiencing homelessness through someone else's perspective, that these sorts of things can be effective tools for increasing empathy, reducing bias, and changing behavior in some ways. So my colleague, who I work with on this project at Stanford University, has been working in VR for over 20 years. In one project, for instance, they have a chainsaw, virtual chainsaw, where you cut down a tree, as opposed to reading about the effects of cutting down trees. And those people actually use less paper immediately after and longer term than those who read about cutting down trees. So the act of having to cut down a tree, which we don't want to take people into a forest and have them cut down trees, that's what we mean by prohibitive. But doing it in virtual reality where you feel the shake and you feel like you're cutting down the tree, right? Even that experience can be very effective in shifting behavior. So now we're trying to apply this to experiences of racism. So when I talk about the target audience for this experience being white liberals, I get some pushback where they say, aren't you preaching to the choir? And I started putting a picture of a choir in my talk to say, yes, I'm absolutely preaching to the choir. I want to target a group that espouses beliefs of justice and equity, but whose behavior may not be matching up with those beliefs. And I feel like psychologically, one of two things need to happen once that disconnect is made crystal clear to you. Either you shift your ideology or you shift your behavior. But staying in a place where you're accepting that those two things are not connected in the way that you think they are is an uncomfortable place to stay. I like this quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates, which I think really captures what we're trying to do with the VR. He says, but for all of our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it lodges brains, blocks airways, tips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bone, breaks teeth. You must always remember the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions, the health research, all land with great violence upon the body. And can we take this notion of racism being a visceral experience, not just a set of data points, not just an abstract hypothetical that you think we can't measure, and make that something that's more personal and real for people who don't have to deal with it in the same way in their everyday experiences? So the experience that we created puts you into the shoes of Michael Sterling as a child, an adolescent, and an adult. So for those of you who are familiar with VR, this type of VR, you put on a headset, you have hand controllers. When you move your hands, the avatar moves their hands. When you move your head, the avatar moves their head. You have control over that body. So we have you become this young black boy with small brown hands. We have you transition into an adolescent version and then an adult version, the same person. So I'll walk you through a little bit of the experience. It's not the same, of course, with me describing it. But in the first scene, we have you sitting down. Well, let me first say this. So the work, in terms of the process, was very empirically driven. We took existing data, say around disciplinary practices in the classroom around race, and used that to inform the creation of the experiences in the VR. We also used personal narratives and anecdotes that was shared with us to integrate into the piece. So in this first scene, you're in your elementary school classroom, you're sitting on the floor. So you, the user with the hand controllers and the headset, are sitting cross-legged on the floor. We want you to feel small. We want you to see your small hands. You're able to grab and play with these blocks. So you can stack them, you can toss them. The kids in the scene, and I can explain the technical parts for people who are interested in terms of how we captured this, but those are real actors who were filmed on a green screen. The kids on the scene are saying things like, hey, and looking toward you, Michael, throw the fireball, throw the black fireball. Black is always the scariest color. So we're trying to capture the ways in which racialized language even gets introduced among young children who may not even really understand what they're saying. 98% of the people who go into this experience throw the block toward the other kids. They usually throw it at this one kid right there who's the one that says, throw the scary black fireball. People usually launch the block toward him. When you do that, though, it triggers, and you can make it an interactive thing where your actions trigger another thing that happens in VR. So you throwing that block triggers a white female teacher who's out of this particular shot, who stands up and says, Michael, you're being dangerous. You're going to hurt someone, right? In one version of the experience, you actually get placed in timeout. So in spite of the other kids engaging in the exact same behavior, it's your behavior that triggers this aggressive response from the teacher. Again, we're not making that up. We have the empirical base that suggests that that's consistent across the country, specifically for black boys. In the second scene, you're in a mirror. We use mirrors a lot. You see yourself transition to an adolescent version of yourself, and you're in your bedroom in Brooklyn, New York. You're able to walk around the room, so it's an immersive experience. So you can turn and look around you, look down, look up. It's a completely built-out world. You can toss this basketball and try and get it into the goal. There's an alert that pops up on the screen in your bedroom that says an unarmed black teen has been shot by a white officer. So again, we're trying to capture not just the things that are happening directly to you, but the ways in which things are also around you. You get a phone call from your friend. You can grab and pick up the cell phone. It's your friend Adam, who is white. It's time to go to your basketball games. You then transition downstairs. Your mother is sitting watching the news and says, Michael, you need to change. The police, I just saw in the news that the police are looking for someone who's dressed very similarly to you. Adam is resisting and saying, it's okay, Mrs. So-and-so, we're running late, it's not a big deal. And your mother then says, don't forget what happened to your brother. So again, we're trying to capture a mother's vigilance to have to worry about what t-shirts you have on when you exit the house, indicating that this is something that's intergenerational, that's also already happened in this family. It's a valid concern that has to be worried about. And the clueless white friend who thinks it's not a big deal because it's not a part of his day-to-day experience. You grab your hoodie, you put it on, you go outside. On the street, you see a black male neighbor and other neighbors on the street. The black male neighbor, very friendly, is saying, hey, Michael, have a great game. Sorry, I can't be there. There are other neighbors on the street. Suddenly, a police car pulls up and 3 officers jump out and tell you to get down on your knees and put your hands up. You, the user, get down on your knees and put your hands in the air while 3 officers are cursing and yelling at you. You haven't done anything wrong. You're just standing on the sidewalk. The neighbors are yelling, leave that boy alone. He didn't do anything. Someone go get his mother. And in the midst of that chaotic sound, the lights go out, the sound goes off, and you hear the voice of your mother say, just do what you have to do to get home alive. Again, a script in your head, minimize threat. Don't experience your actual emotions. Just do what you have to do to get home alive. Even if this is completely unjustified, even if anger is completely justified, you can't do that and get out alive. Right? So be less of yourself, be smaller, feel less of what you're feeling for the sake of surviving. You later transition to a workplace scene where you're an adult applying for a job. You approach an administrative assistant who's at a desk. You have your resume. You're able to see on your resume there's a Yale logo, other information about your work experience. I have no affiliation with Yale. I just thought that sounded fancy. But it sounds fancy, right? It sounds way fancier than Harvard. So you put that in the box, and the administrative assistant is a little bit stank to you, right? Y'all know what stank means, right? There's a little bit rude, doesn't want to grab it. She's like, just put it over there, that sort of thing. It's so interesting. I've been doing work with law firms and different kinds of companies, and oftentimes it's usually white women who say, that doesn't happen. That's not really happening to you, right? And they're sort of like, and then the black people in the room are like, yes, it happened on my way in, right, that I get treated this way. Anyway, so there's this guy, we'll call him Chad. I don't remember his actual name, the character's name. Blackens the way he's speaking to you, right, when you walk up. Like he's trying to be cool, he's trying to be down. When the interviewer approaches on this side, he goes directly to Chad and says, hi, you must be our candidate from Yale. We're so excited to meet you. The administrative assistant in the background says, actually, Michael's our candidate from Yale. And it's the first time that the interviewer even turns and acknowledges your presence at all. The interviewer then says, you don't mind if I take him back first, do you? And takes him back, even though you were clearly the candidate that he was most excited to meet. You later get a phone call when you're back home that says, you're such an excellent candidate, but you're just not a good cultural fit for the organization. So I wanted to give you a sense of what the movements look like. This is an early draft of the environment, but when the user is moving the hand controllers, the body is moving. This is actually really important to give you a sense of this is happening to you, or that at least you have some connection to this body. Same thing with the interactive components of the piece. So getting down on your knees, playing with blocks, playing with the basketball, picking up a phone, having to use the body is an important piece. Being able to see the body in a mirror is an important component of feeling like you're immersed and embodied in this experience. So this is an example of the police scene. And I just want to show you the trailer.
Mike, look at me!
Leave that boy alone!
Black is always the scariest. He didn't do anything! anything wrong.
I know what that
Black fireball, Mike. Make
You can't leave here dressing like that.
is. Us against them.
Dangerous? I shouldn't have to tell you.
Sorry, didn't notice you there.
Just brush it off.
You have now become Mike Sterling. Look at yourself in the mirror.
So this notion of a 1,000-cut journey is meant to capture that it's not just the police, right? It's not someone calling you the N-word. It's not just someone following in the store. It's death by 1,000 cuts, right? Thinking about the implications for health. It's the thousands of ways across one's life course that you take these hits, both subtle and blatant, that can take a toll on how you're able to live and thrive in your life. And it's these subtleties, being dismissed, being ignored, the ways in which this adds up over time that can be very difficult to convey to people who haven't lived this experience. And so I don't think I should have had to use time and resources to create a virtual reality piece for people to experience racism, because it's really in your face every day, right? If you pay attention and do the math, as I say. But felt like this might be a powerful tool to help people walk in an experience that's very different from their own, to help them engage in a slightly different way. This doesn't suggest that someone will come out of this thinking, and thank God no one has said this to me, that I know what it's like to be a black man. Of course you don't, right? But what I hope that the target audience comes out saying is, I thought I understood this, but I don't. And now I'm going to listen differently when we're having a diversity training. I'm going to listen differently when someone's presenting data to me. I'm going to engage differently when I'm thinking about my own data and the patterns that I'm observing in that work. We're trying to shift the ways that people think and act, not just the ways in which they feel. So this work was developed, like I said, in collaboration with Stanford University, Jeremy Baylinson, who leads the Virtual Human Interaction Lab, and was funded by the Brown Institute for Media Innovation. It was based on a transdisciplinary design. So what that means is that I proposed a broad framework for the work, but it was really this multidisciplinary team that came together to think about what is it that we're trying to represent, what elements are important, both from a technical perspective as well as a content perspective. There's no hierarchy in that the engineers are more important than the social workers. Everyone has equal input and say in what it is that we're trying to capture. As was mentioned, this premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2018, which is a really interesting way to go public with a project like this, because prior to the film festival, we had only run like 20 people through it, and then all of a sudden we run thousands of people at a film festival. But I'm happy to unpack. There's lots of things that came up for me that I didn't expect, that I was talking with some of the students about earlier, in terms of what it feels like as a black person seeing white people experience racism. To see them on their knees with their hands up, and to see that over and over and over again. The feeling of seeing white people sign up to experience racism, to volunteer to experience racism. There's complex emotions that happen. That's not something I really thought about or unpacked prior to the festival. So I'm a psychologist by training primarily, and so is Jeremy. And so we're interested in what some of the empirical implications are in terms of attitudes and behavior. And so we've been running a series of studies that I don't have time to go into, but we're interested in pre, post, and longitudinal effects on a variety of indicators that I'm happy to talk about and unpack. But really want to leave you that what's ultimately, the data aside, the empirical work aside, what we believe is that achieving racial justice requires that we all understand racism, and not an understanding that emerges from intellectual exercise or even in the consumption and production of science, but rather a visceral understanding that connects to spirit and body as much as reason. That the data, it's not just data points, right? It's lived experience that has real implications, real experiences that warrant more attention than we don't know how to measure that, so I'm not going to consider it or grapple with it in my work or my research. And also, when my students say things like, I've never experienced racism, usually my white students, I tell them, you've absolutely experienced racism. You're just experiencing the other side of it, right? But you're not exempt from the process. You're not exempt from the culture. And you don't get to opt out. And opting out is racist, right? Because who has the option to choose to engage or not, to choose to dip their toe in versus pay attention or not pay attention? Who shows up to hard discussions versus who doesn't? That is a racist act in and of itself, because it's a privilege not everyone has to opt in and opt out. So I ask you all to think carefully about your place in this ecosystem of race and racism. And whiteness and white people are an explicit, considerable part of this problem. And we have to name and grapple with that more directly. Racism, again, is not a problem of the people of color, the black people in the room. It's a problem that came out of very, very different roots around white supremacy that we have to grapple with in its various forms that extends well beyond KKK hoods and the ways in which it shows up in our culture and our norms and our policies and our assumptions. Thank you.
So thank you for a really just stirring lecture for us. And we're going to take some time to get some questions. And I'm going to try not to interrupt the natural flow of Q&A here. I'm just here to open the floor. And I'll expect that you can cut people off in love if you need to.
Yeah, cut you off in love. Okay. I'm just going to say that.
Exactly. And I think there's one in the back. Debbie, did you have your hand up?
Oh, I was waiting, but that's
Okay.
So, just incredible work.
Thank you.
I had visceral reaction to it.
Just talking about it, right?
White liberals. So I'm very intrigued about how we could make this available to people, particularly college students, because I'm very interested in college student health, and I think a lot of college students don't have an appreciation of this. I don't pretend that I have an appreciation of it. I've been working on it, becoming more anti-racist actively. So how is this available for people?
So that's sort of an outcome of the film festival that we didn't expect because it was such a big public platform. And lots of companies started coming and saying, can you do our training with our so-and-so and this group and that group? And we've tried to be very careful about how to do that because, one, we're still collecting data. We have no idea what we're doing to people when we put them through this, right? But we have started doing a couple of things in an exploratory way. So one, we've integrated it into our curriculum at the Columbia School of Social Work. So I helped design a class that is now required for our first-year graduate students that's called Decolonizing Social Work, Power, Racism, Oppression, and Privilege. This very explicit anti-Black centering and anti-oppressive lens, right? And so students are required to take that course. Half of them do the VR in addition to taking the class, and then we're assessing their performance in the course over the semester to see if the VR adds something to that process. We're also doing work with the University of Michigan that's trying to think about ways to integrate emerging technologies into their curriculum as well. So yes, we've been doing that. We've also done smaller things like just hosting workshops and focus groups so people go through the VR and then we have a discussion about it and in relation to other sorts of issues. We've done that with Wisdom named some of the companies we've been working with, but companies around the country who are interested in doing that kind of work. I am specifically interested in working with senior leadership. So one, VR is complicated in setting up, getting people through it. It's easier to get 50 through it than 500, right? And so with our company, with our private sector work, we're working with the C-suite, for instance, so senior leadership of organizations who have control over decision-making, allocation of resources, et cetera, and using that as our point of entry. And I would argue probably the same is useful in academic settings. So working with deans, other senior leaders within the academic setting to help shift their perspective taking on some of these issues. So yes, we are doing that work and interested in talking with people who might want to do it. Mm-hmm.
I guess I want to know what's your point of view on intersectionality and how, whether or not VR can be applied to, let's say, a Black woman.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's already intersectional, right? So it's a Black male. There's particular ways in which we dealt with socioeconomic status, but yes, there are other positionalities that could be important for representing in this. I'll give you the short version of, I just had this conversation with some students earlier about why I, as a Black woman, focused on Black male experience versus a Black female experience. And my conscious choice was that that's kind of where the public discourse was centered and strategically was a good point of entry for this very experimental thing. Subconsciously, upon reflection, I think that it would have been very vulnerable for me to unpack Black womanhood. I had just become a mother at the time of doing this to a Black boy. So I think it would have been too much for me to see my own experience over and over and over and over again on the screen and having to talk about it all the time. So I think subconsciously that was what was driving me. But yes, you absolutely can. It's expensive to make, and it's not like just a swap out kind of thing. So you'd really have to think about from the beginning a Black woman's experience. What would I do? What would I create? What would I want to represent? Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you this question because I'm not a racist. I'm a good person.
Okay.
So
I'm going to put that on a T-shirt.
I left my pin at home. So I'm wondering what you think about the medium, right? So the virtual reality and it's definitely immersive and it's the most intense, right?
Yeah.
Do you think you can achieve any of the goals with a cheaper medium, like a graphic novel?
Yeah, I think we've been doing that for a long time. I think novels, theater, movies have been deeply impacting people around these issues for a long time. So it's not a replacement or even better than those. I think it's a different way to achieve some of that.
Because you could more easily swap out. I mean, I totally get that having a Black woman would be a very expensive venture to do all of the
whole different thing, yeah.
sections. But with a graphic novel in print, it's like super easy.
Yes, I think
But
part of
I understand you may not get the same effect, but I'm just wondering but you do think that you could get an effect.
I think we have. I think we know that from media in general. There can be various forms of media are very powerful in shaping our ideals, our beliefs, and our behavior. So I think it's interesting to think about a different approach that can put you into circumstances in more of a first-person point of view that's potentially different, potentially powerful in a different way, but I wouldn't say more powerful than some of these other ways of doing it. But if it does do something different than these other media do, then it may be worth considering as something that we expand. But I think one of the values, so when I wrote the proposal for this project, I had never used virtual reality. I barely understood what it was. And I'm like, yeah, walk in someone else's shoes, virtual reality, right? That makes sense. But because of that, I'm not invested in the tech. I'm invested in the content, right? The idea. And so I'm willing for the tech not to be the way for us to go. And that maybe you should just read a vignette, right? Or maybe you should do some other thing.
Well, because I should have actually prefaced my question a little bit better because not just to necessarily read a graphic novel, but to integrate it into another experience, like a small group. You know, like you could imagine giving 10 people the same thing to read, and then 15 minutes later they come together and talk about it. What would it have felt like, and to interact with kind of what would it have felt like, role play?
Yeah. So I think there's many ways to achieve perspective taking to increase empathy. And what VR might be better at is changing behavior and thinking. But I don't know for sure yet.
Thank you.
Yes, in the back here.
So I think this is really cool and has the potential to change norms, which I think are hard to change. And I'm sitting here thinking my own area of research is, nutrition, physical activity, obesity, and I'm thinking, I know this is expensive technology, but I can see the value of doing something like this for weight stigma, weight bias, and I'm wondering if you've thought about, your area of research obviously is in racism, but do you see this being useful in another area like weight bias, weight stigma?
Yeah, and people are doing that. People are doing or tackling this from taking on different bodies of different weights, being a woman, people are using it for domestic violence interventions and having men becoming a woman who's being verbally abused, which is, there's all sorts of ethical issues around this space too. But yes, I think people should do that, and people are doing it. Mm-hmm.
Can you give me a sense, I don't know that well about the virtual reality literature and the results of these studies. Have you done the use of virtual reality to enhance empathy in certain situations, to change behavior, where it's been effective in those contexts?
Yes. There's also, there's work around homelessness. There's the tree cutting example that I just gave you. So there's lots of examples along those lines.
The kinds of efficacy that you
So generally that is the trend. There are some examples with white men becoming white women, becoming more biased against women. So it doesn't always do what you think it's going to do. And people haven't quite figured out what is it about that experience or what is it about white men that might be tricky in that regard. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. Research is fascinating. One of the things I come upon when I'm doing this work and trying to have conversations with white people about racism, the most common response I get is, I'm not racist and I agree that this is important work and I haven't said anything because I don't know what to say and I don't want to be offensive. And we've talked about the importance of denouncing white privilege, recognizing your privilege and denouncing it for the sake of equality for other groups, for Black people explicitly. And then I find myself doing the work for them, which is exhausting. So I'm wondering, what would you say about how we can engage in conversations without people of color feeling like the burden is on us to figure things out?
I mean, I think that's also reflective of the cultural norms of your institution. I don't know a lot about this space, but in most spaces, for instance, white people are uncomfortable, and I notice, nonverbal behaviors, for instance, white people get uncomfortable being named as a group even, but they're very comfortable naming other groups as collectives, right? But you name white people and people start to shift in their seats a little bit and get uncomfortable that you're categorizing them in that way. So that's a big cultural shift, that naming whiteness and white people as a group in the context of white supremacy, and also naming white supremacy, not just white privilege, and in the context of our conversations about racism, become an important cultural norm, because it makes centering their reflection and their thought about being implicated in this system as something to consider as a distinct experience. Right now, what it is do I have an individual commitment or ability to engage or not? And that's kind of that opt-in and opt-out. So yes, I think we could have a conversation about things that you do at an individual level, but there's also the institution starting to hold whiteness accountable for its role in white supremacy and racism within these institutions. And what we tend to do is avoid that language altogether, because racism also makes people squirm in their seats. That feels too icky. So let's say bias, that feels a little better. Let's say microaggressions. Let's say diversity, right? Because that all feels a little more manageable for my sensibilities. And we also have to think about whose sensibilities are we prioritizing, whose comfort are we prioritizing in our engagement around these issues. So I would say, instead of putting it on you as an individual in terms of managing this, I would push the organization to think more carefully about the institution and cultural norms that they're setting around these types of conversations, and who are they holding accountable in the ways we engage. Here, and then I'll go back here.
Fascinating talk. I'm struck, and I'm thinking about your statement that diversity may or may not address racism directly. So on that statement, I have two questions. One, when you are describing your project under virtual reality, that you're immersing in a situation or in a place or a group of people who are different, that is diversity. That you are creating a situation where things, people, whatever environment is different than what the person is.
But what we're emphasizing is not the collective symbolic difference, which is what diversity does. Diversity doesn't unpack what that difference means in the context, right? So diversity in some ways is visual, right?
Yes.
Right? So yes, there's a collective difference at multiple levels that's happening. So yes, that is a piece of it. What we're emphasizing is what comes along with that different experience, and unpacking what that individual experience might look like.
So a follow-up on that. So in many of the institutions all over the country, there's this whole drive for diversity. So what's your take on that, if your statement is that diversity is not directly addressing racism?
That people grapple with equity and inclusion, and once you start to deal with equity, you have to grapple with racism and white supremacy as a part of what's contributing to the problem in the context. The problem is not necessarily representation. And that doesn't mean representation is not something that we should be thinking about. Yes, improve representation, because it's a factor in helping you do all these other things. It is not the solution, though. It is one piece of it. And so grappling with, why is it necessary for us to have to increase diversity? Why do we even have to try to do that?
Why do you have to work so hard?
Why do we have to work so hard? Or once we do get it, why does it go away so fast? Right? We've recruited some of the most talented people from around the country, and somehow they leave. Why are they not staying here? You might categorize that as they couldn't cut it, or you might categorize that as being a problem y'all have. Right? That's not them, it's you. And so that is an equity and inclusion framing, as opposed to just the color that's mixed in the room. Right? This is a diverse room. There's not equity in this room, no. And there's probably not inclusion in this room. Those are different things, different problems. And we kind of lump them all together.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was fascinating. What's resonating the most with me is your language around anti-racist work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So going back to your point about that racial battle fatigue of, people of color sort of, taking on the burden and the work against, racism. I think sort of shifting that language and that mindset for folks, who perhaps could be allies in this space, is really critical. So I really did appreciate that one.
Thank you. Yeah. And trying to make it clear that you are currently not showing up. Right? You're not actually giving anything up. You're not actually trying to create equity when there's an opportunity to do so. That would mean that when you're appointed as chair of a committee that you really shouldn't be the chair of, that you step down and recommend someone else to do that work. That's letting go of the potential prestige of being chair, blah, 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 and really shifting it to someone else when you know that that work might be better served by someone else. That's an equity choice. We miss those opportunities for equity every day. We have multiple decisions a day to make. Yeah, we have multiple decisions a day where we could help increase equity, and we don't show up.
Asking those questions like, what are the things that you're doing to be anti-racist? Okay, I get it, you're not racist. So what are you doing? Can we talk about what are the active behaviors and actions and examples like you just shared, that you are sort of contributing to inclusion as opposed to perpetuating the system of oppression that, has barriers for the underrepresented population.
And that's grounded in thinking about racism in a much different way than two white boys marching through campus saying the N-word. Yes, that is racism. And so is all this other stuff that would never be blatantly categorized as that. And so when you get the opportunity to be anti-racist, you have to see it. You have to see racism in its multiple forms, not just the KKK hoods, right? So you're missing all these opportunities because you're also missing what racism is and how it's actually showing up in our organizations and spaces.
I want to sort of follow up on what Seth was saying about thinking about where to go from here. And I love that you're using this creative medium right now to figure out how to change people. And I also wondered, could you show them a film of this experience, and how far does that get you towards your outcomes? What kind of outcomes do you have? But then beyond that, so if you may try this with some other media that are less expensive, that you may be able to use in more places to help spread this intervention and see if it gets you most of the way, but is much more feasible to share widely, that would be fabulous. But I'm thinking also about the next step. So when you're telling me what I need to watch out for in this bureaucracy that I'm living in and interacting in, those points are not addressed here. So yes, I may gain empathy that I didn't have before. I may begin to notice some things, but I think a next step would be to think about how to incorporate, then if I'm a part of the target audience, what do I need to be doing instead? What are the situations in which I may realistically find myself doing what I really don't want to be doing? And maybe having people practice that, rehearse that, think about that, and connect it to their everyday behaviors.
So I think it's one thing for me to describe it, and it's another thing for you to go through it. So I would argue that you don't actually know yet what it is and what it feels like and how it would translate into empathy versus something else. Because of what we're finding is that it's moving beyond just empathy, it seems, in the effect that it's having on people.
So are you going to give us a taste of what you've been finding then?
We're still analyzing the data, so I don't feel comfortable doing that. But just from the thousands of people we've run and the kinds of feedback that we've been getting, it seems like it's also shifting an assessment of the problem of race, and so how you're thinking about racism as an issue in your own context. I'll give you one example, and I'll come to your second point. One example is a white female who came out of the experience and went to a coffee shop to kind of decompress. It's sort of an intense thing to go through. And she got a news article about police violence in England, where she's from. And she wrote to me later and said, I read that article in a very different way, having gone through this experience. And it wasn't just empathy. She was analyzing the problem of police violence in England differently. And she was sort of sharing with me that she's doing that. That's actually empirically very difficult to measure, that type of shift. So one, yes, we're trying to collect data and get a sense of what's going on. I'm also not certain that we're actually capturing whatever the effect is, and we're going to be limited in some ways by the design that we opted to put in place in terms of getting a sense of what's going on. So my answer to you about our empirical data is not the end-all be-all of what we actually think is going on. The second piece is people have to take responsibility for their own engagement. And I also feel like people jump to the doing, which I'm encouraging you to do, before they actually understand what it is that they're trying to do something about. So in these conversations, people often want me to have a training. So what's the training? How do I act differently? Tell me what to do and I'll do it. And what I would argue is no, you won't, unless you actually understand why you're being asked to do it in the first place. No, you won't, unless you actually understand the problem. So I think the piece, the certainly not perfect, gets us a little bit closer to people thinking about the problem of racism in a much more nuanced way than they did going in. Follow-up is that I'm actually flying to LA tomorrow to film the second version of this piece, where we're recreating some of the narrative experiences, but we're also integrating data visualization to try and help people understand the nature of structural racism in a more concrete way. So I'll give you some examples of how we're doing that. I was sharing this earlier. So we're playing around with, for instance, the ability to drag a scene forwards in time or backwards in time and see how policies have changed, that policy decisions have changed that environment. Or if a different policy decision had been made, where might this community be if we had done this versus that, right? And visually being able to engage with that. We're thinking about ways to use zip code as a prison bar on your shirt that comes along with information about you. We know how powerful zip code is in predicting a number of things about people, and you being able to touch that and get information not only about that person, but how it's connected to other people in the environment as well. So we're trying to build an educational component into it to make it more literal and more concrete, to help people understand what are the real implications, not just the emotional experience. But in addition, even though the first piece is more emotionally focused, what I'm finding, at least anecdotally, is that it's not just emotion that's happening. There are other things that are happening that are critical for changes in behavior. There's the sense that not only are you becoming or embodying a Black male, which the becoming part I'm not actually certain about. It's more like you're in a shell of a person. What I didn't anticipate, and we're not measuring at all in the empirical study, is the ways in which people have told us it's made their whiteness more salient being this Black man. And I think it's something about, it's such a contrast in experience that it makes how different your experience actually is because you're having this other experience so salient for you. So there's a lot that's happening just by going through this that's more than just tears and gut wrench. I think there are more meaningful shifts that are happening as well, some of which we might capture in the empirical work, but most of which are going to have to be captured in a really different way that I haven't quite figured out how to do it.
So a struggle within VR and games literature is getting people to generalize. So, you know, the example that you gave with the woman reading the newspaper story, that's really parallel to that particular scene.
Mm-hmm.
But are people then generalizing to other kinds of contexts and recognizing the issue there?
And that's what you want. And so, yeah, right. And so part of what we're also clear about is that the VR is not a magic pill that's going to change your structural analysis of race in society, but what it might do is set you up for a different kind of engagement outside of the headset, which is why we think use in a classroom is particularly useful, because now you get a semester to help people engage and develop a rich structural analysis of these kinds of problems, but it might help them engage differently than had they not started with this virtual reality. I don't know if that's true, but it's sort of what comes outside the headset that we think is most powerful in terms of translation and generalizing beyond the immediate circumstances that are represented in the piece itself.
Well, I want to invite us to, it's 1:30.
Okay.
And I want to be mindful of time, so that folks have places to get to. I want us to first thank Dr. Cogburn for her. Who's the director of InCHIP, to have any final words that you might want to.
I mean, this has been a fantastic visit so far. I had the pleasure of having dinner with Courtney yesterday. She was gracious to meet with some of our psychology students as well. And I think this has been eye-opening. I know you couldn't fit all of your research in. She's done some great work on looking at Twitter and the effects of
different incidents, on health outcomes, really just a rich body of research that you're providing to us, and I really appreciate having you here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you.